I never thought I would spend 10 years of my life working for the same company, only to be fired in a room that didn't even have a window. And the worst part, my boss looked completely calm when he said it. We're going in a different direction. That was his explanation. 10 years. Reduced to one sentence. I was 34 years old, had a mortgage, bills, and a daughter who depended on me. And suddenly, I had no job. But what my boss didn't know was that I had already started noticing strange things inside the company. And 1 week before I was fired, I found something that made me realize I wasn't being fired because I was a bad employee. I was being fired because I knew too much. My name is Daniel, and this is how I found out what my boss had been hiding for years. I started working at Westbridge Solutions when I was 24. Back then, the company was small. There were maybe 30 employees, and everyone knew everyone. I worked hard, stayed late, covered shifts, and eventually became one of the most trusted people in the department. My boss, Mark, used to tell everyone that I was the kind of employee companies dream about. I believed him. Looking back, I realized that was probably the biggest mistake I ever made. Things started changing about 2 years before I was fired. Mark suddenly became obsessed with keeping certain financial reports away from employees. He started having private meetings with executives. He told us not to ask questions. Then people began disappearing. One employee would be there on Friday and gone on Monday. Another would suddenly resign, but nobody actually knew why. I remember asking Mark about it one afternoon. He smiled and said, "Daniel, just focus on your job." So I did. Until one Monday morning, I received an email from accounting asking me to review a file. The file contained numbers that didn't make sense. Payments were being made to a company I had never heard of. Thousands of dollars every month. The strange thing was, the company had almost the exact same address as one of Mark's private businesses. I thought it was a coincidence. Then I noticed something else. The payments had been approved using my department code. My department code. The same code connected to my employee account. I immediately went to Mark's office. He was sitting behind his desk, looking at his phone. I said, "Mark, I think there's a mistake in these financial records." He looked up. His expression changed instantly. Not anger, not confusion, fear. He closed his laptop and asked me one question. "Who else has seen that file?" I said. "Nobody." He stared at me for a few seconds, and then told me to forget about it. I should have listened. Instead, I started looking, and 3 days later, I discovered something that made my stomach drop. Someone had been using my employee credentials to approve payments I never authorized, and when I checked the dates, some of those approvals happened while I was sitting at home with my daughter. That meant someone inside the company was using my identity. I took screenshots. I saved copies. I didn't tell anyone. Then, exactly 1 week later, Mark called me into that windowless room. He closed the door. He sat across from me, and he said the sentence that changed my life. "Daniel, today is your last day." I asked him why. He simply pushed a folder across the table and said, "We've decided your position is no longer necessary." I looked at the folder. Then I looked at him, and suddenly everything made sense. He wasn't firing me because of performance. He was trying to remove the one person who had discovered what he was doing. I walked out of that room carrying 10 years of memories in one cardboard box, but I also walked out carrying something Mark didn't know I had: the screenshots, the payment records, and a backup copy of the files. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't, because that night, someone knocked on my front door, and when I opened it, there was a woman standing there holding a folder with my name on it. She looked at me and said, "Daniel, if you really want to know why you were fired, you need to see this." I didn't know this woman. She didn't know me. Yet she was standing outside my house at almost 9 at night, holding a folder with my name on it. I asked her who she was. She said her name was Sarah, and that she had worked in the company's finance department for 6 years. Then she said something I will never forget. "Mark fired me 3 months ago because I asked the same questions you did." I let her inside. She opened the folder and showed me documents, emails, payment records, and copies of internal reports. According to Sarah, Mark had been moving company money through several small businesses connected to people close to him. But that wasn't even the worst part. The company had been reporting certain expenses under employee accounts. Mine was only one of them. Sarah had discovered the pattern months earlier. She tried to report it to the company's executive board, but her complaint disappeared. Then she was fired. She told me she had been afraid to speak because she thought nobody would believe her. But when she heard I had suddenly been fired after 10 years, she knew something was wrong. I asked her why she came to me instead of going to the police. She looked at me and said, "Because I need someone who has proof from inside." That night, we spent hours comparing our documents, and slowly the picture became clear. Mark wasn't working alone. Someone higher up knew about the money, someone with enough authority to protect him. We found emails between Mark and one of the executives discussing payments that were never supposed to appear in the official records. Then we found something even more shocking. My termination had been discussed 2 weeks before I was officially fired. The decision wasn't based on my performance. They had already decided to remove me before they even gave me the fake explanation. But why me? Sarah showed me a spreadsheet. My name was highlighted. Next to it was a note that said, "Has access to historical records." That was the moment I understood. I wasn't fired because I made a mistake. I was fired because I had access to old files that could expose years of financial activity. Sarah told me we needed to protect the evidence before confronting anyone, so we made multiple copies and stored them in different places. Then we contacted an attorney. The attorney reviewed everything and told us something terrifying. Do not contact Mark. Do not warn the company. And do not alter a single file. Because if our evidence was real, this wasn't just an employee dispute. It could become a criminal investigation. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely powerless. Then, at 7:14 the next morning, my phone rang. It was Mark. I almost didn't answer, but I did. He sounded unusually friendly. He said, "Daniel, I think we may have made a mistake." I stayed silent. Then he offered me something I never expected. My job back. Same salary, same position, and a promotion. But there was one condition. I had to sign a document saying I had no claims against the company. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because suddenly I knew exactly what he was afraid of. I told him I needed time to think. He said, "Take the weekend." Then he hung up. Sarah looked at me and said, "He knows." I asked, "How?" She pointed at the table. One of the files we had copied the night before was missing. Someone had entered my house while I was asleep. They hadn't stolen my laptop. They hadn't taken money. They had taken only one thing, the original folder containing the evidence. I felt my heart drop. Whoever had entered my house knew exactly what they were looking for. And suddenly, this wasn't just about losing my job anymore. Someone was willing to cross a much bigger line to make sure I stayed quiet. The next morning, I woke up knowing one thing. I was done being afraid. Sarah and I gave everything we had to the attorney. The missing folder was reported. The financial records were preserved. And then something happened that neither of us expected. The attorney contacted federal investigators. For weeks, nothing happened. I kept waking up wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I had lost my job. My reputation was at risk. My family was worried. And Mark was still walking into that company every morning like nothing had happened. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I received an email from the company. They wanted me to attend a meeting. I almost refused, but my attorney told me to go. So I walked back into the same building where I had worked for 10 years. The same hallway, the same desks, the same people who once called me a friend. Mark was sitting at the conference table. He smiled when I entered. "Daniel," he said, "I'm glad you came." I sat down. He placed a document in front of me. It was an agreement offering me my old job back. He said the company wanted to resolve everything quietly. I looked at the document and asked him one question. "Why are you so desperate for me to sign this?" His smile disappeared. Before he could answer, the conference room door opened. 2 investigators walked in. Mark froze. The executives froze. Nobody spoke. One investigator placed a folder on the table and said, "We need to ask some questions about company payments." Mark looked at me. I could see the anger in his eyes. But for the first time, he couldn't control the situation. The investigation lasted months. Records were reviewed. Bank transactions were traced. Employee credentials were examined. And eventually, the truth came out. Millions of dollars had been moved through fake vendors and private companies. Several employees had unknowingly been used to authorize transactions. Sarah had been telling the truth, and my employee credentials had been used because I was one of the people with access to historical records. Mark was eventually removed from the company. Several executives were investigated, and the company had to explain years of financial activity that they had tried to hide. But the strangest part happened months later. I received a letter from the company's new leadership. They apologized. They admitted that my termination had been handled unfairly. They offered me my job back with a huge salary increase. I said no, not because I hated the company, but because 10 years had taught me something. A paycheck is not worth losing your peace. Today, I work somewhere else. I make less money than the company offered me, but I come home every night knowing that I don't have to wonder who is lying to me. Sarah and I stayed friends. She eventually found a new job too, and sometimes we still talk about that night she showed up at my door with the folder. She once told me, if Mark hadn't fired you, we might never have found the truth. I think about that a lot, because sometimes the thing you think is destroying your life is actually removing you from a place that was never safe for you. Getting fired after 10 years felt like the end of my life. It wasn't. It was the moment I finally stopped trusting the wrong people. And if there's one thing I learned from everything that happened, it's this. Never underestimate the quiet employee, the person sitting in the corner, the person nobody notices, because sometimes they are the person who sees everything